when I went to the Nixon White House, as I said, I reported to John Ehrlichman, and I also was part of the staff secretary operation. Make a long story short, the staff secretary operation is where all the documents that come into the president come. And it's your job, I was the, quote, assistant staff secretary, it was your job to be sure that everything is in order for the president to make an intelligent decision. And President Nixon liked, on the domestic policy arena, to do lots on paper. I mean, if he had working groups and cabinet groups, and he'd meet with them occasionally, but he really liked to see, he wanted everybody else to hash it out, and then he really liked to see the options on paper. So that actually gave the people in the staff secretary and the White House Domestic Policy Council an awful lot of power at a very young age. I mean, there I was, 23 years old, telling cabinet members what to do, which is probably not a very rational thing when you think about it. But that was not the problem I had. The problem I had was that when I called cabinet offices, remember, there's no email, there's no cell phones, weren't even fax machines, I don't think.
And so for those watching this film now going, what? There was no email?
So you called, and when I would call the cabinet member, I could never, ever get through, not only to the cabinet member, but to their executive assistant. Why? Because the receptionist wouldn't put me through. Why? Because I was a female. And I finally figured it out. It took me a while, and so what John Ehrlichman did was he wrote letters, because, again, there were no emails, etc. He wrote a letter to every single cabinet member saying, Bobby Kilberg is my White House fellow, she's a professional, she's a graduate of Yale Law School, she's had her ticket stamped, and you need to take her call because she is my emissary, is my representative. And in those days, you didn't mail the letters. What they did, they had a system-wide, a government-wide delivery service. They had all these messengers that would race around town delivering letters. And other stuff, and so he had that delivered to every cabinet member, and then he called every cabinet member, and then evidently I was mentioned in the cabinet meeting, which I wasn't high enough to go to, but I was mentioned in the cabinet meeting, and it was just a mindset. It wasn't the cabinet members who were male, it wasn't the executive assistants who were mostly male, it was the young receptionist who figured, obviously she cannot be a professional because she's a woman, and it was fascinating. It was just fascinating.
It's really fascinating. A moment in history, we're making a governmental decision that, because it's a gatekeeper, you know, it's clerkism, and so they drew assumptions. So
they drew assumptions. I don't think it was not.
It was not malicious.
No,
it was not malicious. It was just being
the
guard. They were the gatekeeper, and they were doing their job. It's a woman calling for a cabinet member. Clearly, you have to say that we have the importance or value. Other than the fact she's representing the President of the United States and his emissary. So, fascinating, fascinating.
Okay, and then you asked me, what was the question?
So we asked you following your tenure working at the university.
What did I do? Well, again, I've never had, Cynthia asked me when she was over at my house the other day whether I have a strategic plan, and Suzanne and Davis and I talked about this too. I never have. I mean, until this present job, which I was recruited and went through a search process, I never looked for a job in my life. These jobs kind of just fell in my lap. That's not to say that I didn't think about jobs or think, well, maybe I ought to look at this and that, but there was no grand strategy. I maybe talked to one person, somebody talked to another person, and something happened. But when Richard Nixon resigned in August 1974, Don Rumsfeld became chief of staff. Don Rumsfeld had been, when I was a White House fellow, had been the head of OEO, Office of Economic Opportunity, and a White House counselor, having been before that a congressman, and so his office in the West Wing of the White House was 2 floors above mine. He had a real big office. I had this little tiny office where if you smiled, your cheeks, hit the two walls. But nonetheless, and so he was, and his executive assistant was Dick Cheney. It was all kind of funny, but. At any rate,
isn't it interesting to hear these names? So later on,
there was, yeah, I
mean, the historical place they've had in this.
But so Rumsfeld asked me when the president resigned whether I would come to the counsel's office, and I said, well, I can't do that. This is August, and school starts in 2 weeks, and you cannot walk out in an academic institution at the beginning of the academic year. That's just not right. He said, but I will come in June or July. So I did, and so I was only at Mount Vernon for 2 years. If Richard Nixon hadn't resigned, Don Rumsfeld wouldn't have asked me to come back, and I would have wound up staying at Mount Vernon much longer because there were a lot of things I wanted to finish that I didn't. However, this is the one thing I did think through strategically, and that was I was very concerned that as a person who had been in the Nixon White House, that I needed to show, even though I'd left in June of '71 and Watergate didn't happen till the election year of '72, my concern was that people would lump everybody together, and I thought it was very important that I do go back to the White House to show that I wasn't part of that problem, and I could go back to the White House, and that I didn't have this scarlet letter somewhere on me. So that was my strategic motivation. That when he called, I thought, yes, I really need to do that. So I went back as an associate counsel to the president.
So tell me about that job and what you were doing there.
There, I really didn't. It wasn't that there were a lot more women, but I just fell in very nicely with the flow, and I didn't feel that I had to stand up and make any particular points. I did the arts, all from a legal perspective. I did the arts. I continued to do Native American things. I got very involved in export control, administration control topics. I did a lot of civil rights stuff. That was the days of busing. And there were a lot of controversial issues surrounding that. And we spent a lot of time also doing clearances, i.e. when we vetted people for cabinet posts and for assistant secretaryships, et cetera. And it's interesting to me when you look at the vetting that was taking place under Obama or even under Bush 43, things hadn't progressed a whole lot
Really?
in a lot of those years. No, I mean, it was still the same.
And I was thinking it would be so different.
No, you take a look at the forms people had to fill out. They really were fairly parallel. But back then, what I was somewhat amused on, because now a lot of the vetting takes place by Googling people and other things, that obviously didn't happen. But we would get reports from the FBI, and the most work we had to do was because of the reports we got from the FBI, where they were just focused on these questions. So they'd ask your neighbor, does he beat his wife, and are the children clean, and do they get to school in time? And they never ask anything about, well, does this guy have $40 million invested in some fraudulent scheme? That never came up. So we would wind up actually looking at the hard financial stuff and trying, which the FBI did not seem at that point in time to have any capability of doing. And they just focused on, are you a true and loyal American? And, all these questions that today we would find fairly offensive about sexual orientation, et cetera, but nothing about the things that really would affect your ability to do your job. So we spent a lot of time on that.
Interesting, interesting. So how did you find that period of your career there? And where were you in children-wise at this point?
Okay. Well, Gerald Ford was just a wonderful human being, and he came in with, you had high inflation, but you had unemployment, and you had a stagnant growth, and he had this program called WIN, these buttons, if anybody remembers them, that were a big disaster. But basically, he viewed his role as to restore civility and dignity, both to the White House and to the body politic. He was very worried about the fractiousness. And so that's what we spent most of our time doing, being just nice to people and showing people that they were welcome, and that we were a stable society, and that a president having left didn't mean the world had come to an end. Children-wise, that was our first son was born in March of 1975, and I used to, until he was mobile, when I had to come work on Saturdays, I would bring him into the office, and I would just put him on just a blanket, and he would play in Google and play, and I would work, and we had typewriters those days on typewriters. And I remember at least 2 occasions when the president would call meetings in the cabinet room. This wasn't in the Oval Office, but in the cabinet, not in the cabinet room, in the Roosevelt room. And there I was, and there was Jonathan, and he was, 6 months old and starting to crawl. And the president would just say, well, just bring him in. And so I just put him down onto the Roosevelt room table, and we'd have a meeting, and nobody thought that was strange. And that was very Jerry Ford. I mean, he was just as open and as sweet as can be. And when we'd gotten a black lab shortly before he got his golden retriever named Liberty. And he asked me one day how my dog was, and I said he's not behaving. And the next thing I know, the trainer for Liberty is over at my house training my dog. I mean, he was just a very people person who was the salt of the earth. Really just a great guy.